State Senator Malcolm Wright has spent decades fighting for civil rights, but a quiet dinner at an upscale restaurant turns into an unexpected confrontation with subtle racism. His calm but powerful response goes viral, igniting a nationwide debate. As Malcolm navigates public fallout, he faces a new challenge: Lena Bryant, a fiery young activist demanding immediate radical change. As tensions rise between Malcolm's strategic patience and Lena's urgent approach, both must decide: can they bridge the generational divide to achieve lasting justice, or will their differences derail the movement they both fight for? Can they find common ground, or will the fight for justice tear them apart? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories on the fight for equality. The sun was just beginning to set behind the towering skyline of Washington, D.C., casting the city in hues of soft pink and gold. The streets buzzed with the hum of evening traffic, the world rushing past in its usual hurry. Inside Savory Heights, a well-known upscale restaurant in the heart of the city, the mood was far more relaxed. Here, the city's elite gathered to enjoy fine dining, secluded from the noise and chaos outside. The dim lighting, with its golden glow, flickered gently over polished wood tables, while the soft hum of jazz floated through the air. At a table near the back, in a quiet corner away from the center of activity, sat Malcolm Wright. His tailored charcoal suit fit him perfectly, the crispness of his shirt collar reflecting the precision of his professional life. Tall, broad-shouldered, and calm, Malcolm had a quiet air of authority that naturally commanded respect. He had spent the last decade of his life as a state senator, tirelessly advocating for civil rights, equality, and justice. His calm, collected demeanor had won him admirers and allies, but it had also drawn enemies, people who saw him as too persistent, too outspoken about uncomfortable truths. Tonight, however, Malcolm wasn't here to make speeches, meet constituents, or debate policy. Tonight was meant to be a moment of peace, a rare, quiet evening for himself after a grueling day at the Capitol, filled with tense meetings and legislative discussions that had left him mentally drained. As he settled into his seat, Malcolm glanced around the room, taking in the sight of couples sharing intimate conversations and business partners exchanging quiet laughter. The clinking of glasses and the soft shuffle of waitstaff moving briskly between tables created a rhythmic backdrop of luxury. For a brief moment, Malcolm allowed himself to relax, setting aside the day's challenges. He reached for the menu, though he already knew what he wanted. Savory Heights was one of his favorite spots in the city. Its lamb shank was renowned, and he had been craving it all day. He browsed the menu anyway, appreciating the simple act of choosing a meal without pressure. Here, in this dimly lit cocoon of elegance, he could be just another diner, not Senator Malcolm Wright, the public figure under constant scrutiny. Just as he set the menu down, his attention was pulled toward the loud laughter of a group of businessmen seated a few tables away. They were in the middle of an animated discussion, their conversation centered on deals, mergers, and profits, their voices carrying above the general murmur of the restaurant. It wasn't uncommon in this part of town. Savory Heights catered to politicians, business moguls, and the upper echelons of society. Malcolm had grown accustomed to the sound of wealth, but he rarely let it distract him. Across the room, other patrons were engrossed in their own meals and conversations, seemingly oblivious to anyone outside their immediate company. The flickering candlelight reflected off crystal glasses, and the subtle clatter of silverware on porcelain dishes added to the understated elegance of the evening. Malcolm's eyes flicked to the side as Jack Campbell, a middle-aged white waiter with thinning hair and an air of impatience, approached his table. Jack's posture was stiff, his smile barely touching his eyes. There was something in the way he moved, hurried, mechanical, that caught Malcolm's attention immediately. He was used to this kind of atmosphere, the sense that everyone in the room was performing their part in an unspoken play. But Jack's attitude stood out. It was colder than what Malcolm had come to expect in a place like this. "Good evening," Jack said, his voice flat as he glanced briefly at Malcolm before pulling out a small notepad. "What can I get you?" Malcolm, ever composed, smiled politely. "I'll start with a glass of water and would like to order the lamb shank, please." Jack raised an eyebrow, pausing just slightly before responding. His eyes flicked up and down Malcolm's suit, his face giving away a hint of skepticism. "The lamb shank, huh?" he said, his tone carrying a subtle edge. "It's one of our more expensive dishes. Are you sure that's what you want?" There was a beat of silence. Malcolm felt the comment hang in the air, as if it had more weight than the words themselves. It wasn't the first time he had been questioned like this, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. He had experienced these microaggressions throughout his life, small, seemingly innocuous remarks that were designed to remind him of how people like Jack saw him. But tonight, he wasn't in the mood for confrontation, at least not yet. "That'll be fine," Malcolm said, his voice even, though his eyes locked with Jack's for just a moment longer than necessary. He wanted Jack to know that he had heard the insult, that he understood what was behind the question, even if he chose not to escalate it. Jack gave a curt nod, scribbling down the order without another word. He muttered something under his breath, but Malcolm couldn't make out the words. He didn't need to. He had a good idea of the sentiment, and that was enough. As Jack walked away, Malcolm sighed, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. The tension in the air, subtle as it was palpable now. Even a few nearby patrons seemed to sense something had shifted, though they remained focused on their own meals. This was the kind of moment Malcolm had faced many times before, the quiet, insidious racism that followed him into boardrooms, restaurants, and public spaces. It wasn't always loud or overt, but it was always there, lurking beneath the surface of polite society. Malcolm picked up his water glass, taking a slow sip as his thoughts wandered back to the political battles he had faced recently. Just that morning, he had been in a heated debate over a new civil rights bill, a piece of legislation aimed at dismantling systemic bias in hiring practices. It was work he was proud of, work that gave his career meaning. Yet, even as he fought for justice on a large scale, these small moments of prejudice reminded him how deeply ingrained the problem was. Here he was, a state senator with the power to influence policy, and yet he was still being judged not by his achievements, but by the color of his skin. As the minutes passed, Malcolm's patience remained steady. He had learned long ago not to let these things get under his skin too easily. His calm demeanor, the grace with which he handled such situations, was both a strength and a burden. People expected him to be the bigger person, to rise above every slight, no matter how egregious, and most of the time he did. But that didn't mean it didn't take its toll. He glanced at the businessmen again, their laughter louder now as they raised their glasses in a toast. The contrast between their carefree joy and the tension Malcolm felt was sharp, almost painful. It wasn't that he begrudged them their success or their lightheartedness. It was that their world felt so different from his, even when they shared the same space. They could enjoy their evening without a second thought, while Malcolm was left navigating the subtle, unspoken boundaries of race and class that still define so much of American life. After a few more minutes, Malcolm noticed that other tables were receiving their meals while Jack had yet to return with his order. He watched as Jack floated from table to table, greeting customers with a smile that never reached his eyes, but one that was at least polite. With Malcolm, it had been different. The lack of warmth, the casual dismissal was all part of a pattern Malcolm had seen time and time again. It was as though Jack had already decided what kind of customer Malcolm was the moment he saw him. More time passed, and Malcolm's stomach growled softly in protest. His lamb shank still hadn't arrived. He glanced at his watch, realizing it had been far longer than the normal wait time. Jack had avoided his table entirely, and now Malcolm could feel the curious eyes of other diners occasionally flicking toward him. A few nearby patrons exchanged uneasy glances, whispering to one another in hushed tones. They could sense that something wasn't right, but as was typical in these kinds of situations, no one was willing to intervene. Malcolm sighed again, this time with a touch of resignation. He wasn't the type to make a scene unnecessarily, but he also wasn't going to let this slide. There was a line between grace and complacency, and Malcolm had learned over the years how to walk it. He had no intention of allowing Jack's behavior to go unchecked, but he also wasn't interested in causing a public spectacle. Not yet. He raised his hand calmly, catching the eye of another waiter, a younger man named Chris Edwards, who was passing by. Chris noticed Malcolm's gesture immediately and approached with a respectful smile. "Excuse me," Malcolm began, his tone polite but firm. "I've been waiting for my meal for quite some time now. Could you check on the order for me?" Chris blinked, clearly taken aback by the oversight. He hadn't been the one handling Malcolm's table, but the tension in the air was hard to miss. "Of course, sir," he said with a slight nod. "I'll look into it right away." As Chris disappeared into the kitchen, Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his mind already calculating how he would handle the situation once it inevitably came to a head. He wasn't the type to tolerate disrespect, but he also knew that there were ways to address these things that could lead to meaningful change. For now, he would wait and see how the staff handled the delay, but his patience was wearing thin. From across the room, Malcolm caught sight of Jack again. The waiter was busying himself with other tables, his expression tight and controlled. There was no sign of concern or urgency in his demeanor, no indication that he was aware of the growing tension surrounding his neglect of Malcolm's order. It was clear that Jack wasn't expecting any consequences for his behavior. He likely thought he could get away with it, as he had done with so many others before Malcolm. What Jack didn't know was that Malcolm Wright wasn't just any patron. He wasn't a man who would quietly endure mistreatment and walk away. Malcolm had spent his career fighting for equality, and he wasn't about to let this moment pass without addressing it head-on. As Malcolm sipped his water, he could feel the eyes of other patrons on him more acutely now. The curiosity mixed with unease, as if they were waiting to see how he would respond. Some of them had noticed the subtle racism in Jack's treatment, but as always they chose to stay silent, observing but not intervening. The dim lighting of Savory Heights cast long shadows across the restaurant, giving the scene a warm glow. Yet for Malcolm, the warmth of the ambiance had long since faded. As he sat at his table, eyes casually following Jack's movements across the room, his mind drifted between the present and the past, between the visible neglect he faced tonight and the long history of such moments in his life. His stomach grumbled softly again, a reminder of the meal that still hadn't arrived. More than hunger, it was the principle of the matter that was beginning to weigh on him. He hadn't come here looking for a fight. All he had wanted was a quiet evening for himself. Yet, even in a place as refined as this, the specter of racism had found him. Malcolm had learned long ago to recognize the patterns. It started subtly, with the slight hesitation in someone's voice, the extra second of scrutiny in their gaze. Then it built. Comments that seemed innocent, but were loaded with assumptions, actions that appeared random, but were rooted in bias. And finally, the outright neglect, where they treated you as though you didn't belong, as though your presence was somehow an intrusion in their world. He had seen it time and time again. From the boardrooms where his voice was often overlooked to public spaces like this, where he was just another black man in an expensive suit. People rarely recognized him as Senator Malcolm Wright until they were forced to. They saw the suit, the skin and made assumptions that placed him in boxes far smaller than the reality of his life. As his thoughts wandered, his gaze settled again on the group of businessmen a few tables away. Their conversation had shifted from work to leisure, loud laughter punctuating their stories. One of them, a balding man in his 50s, glanced in Malcolm's direction and then quickly looked away, the briefest flicker of discomfort crossing his features. It was a look Malcolm had seen too many times. People sensing something was wrong but not wanting to get involved. They were content to let the situation play out, so long as it didn't disturb their evening. Across the room, couples sat at tables sharing hushed, intimate conversations, completely unaware of the tension building in Malcolm's corner. Or perhaps, more accurately, choosing to ignore it. Malcolm knew that dynamic well. It was always easier to look away, to pretend that these moments of prejudice weren't happening in plain sight. And yet, despite everything, Malcolm remained composed. Years of experience had taught him the value of patience, of picking his battles carefully. He wasn't the type to demand immediate attention or raise his voice at the slightest provocation, but beneath his calm exterior, a quiet storm was brewing, and it was only a matter of time before it found release. Chris, the young waiter who had promised to check on his order, returned to Malcolm's table, his expression filled with an awkward tension that told Malcolm everything he needed to know before the man even spoke. "Sir, I'm terribly sorry," Chris said, his tone respectful but nervous. "There seems to have been some kind of mix-up in the kitchen. Your meal is being prepared now. It should only be a few more minutes." Malcolm nodded slowly, acknowledging Chris's explanation without fully believing it. "I appreciate you looking into it," he replied, his voice measured. He wasn't going to make Chris the scapegoat for what was happening. The problem was with Jack, and Chris was simply trying to do his job. Chris offered a tight smile and quickly retreated, eager to distance himself from the growing tension. Malcolm watched him disappear into the kitchen again, noting the nervous energy in the young man's steps. He probably understood what was going on, but he wasn't in a position to change it. Malcolm had seen this dynamic before, too. People who recognized the wrong but felt powerless to do anything about it. Another 10 minutes passed, and still there was no sign of his food. Malcolm's patience was beginning to wear thin. He took another sip of water, his eyes following Jack as the waiter continued to make his rounds, deliberately avoiding Malcolm's table. It was no longer subtle. Jack was making a point now, ignoring Malcolm entirely, focusing all his attention on the other patrons. To Jack, it was as though Malcolm didn't exist. The whispers from the nearby tables had grown more frequent, though no one spoke loudly enough for Malcolm to make out their words. It didn't matter. He could feel the weight of their glances, the growing sense of discomfort among the other diners. They were noticing the situation now, the way Jack was treating Malcolm. Yet, predictably, no one said anything. The discomfort was palpable, but silence reigned, as it always did in such moments. Malcolm had always been the kind of man who believed in the power of restraint. He understood the value of letting a situation unfold, allowing people to reveal their true nature before responding. But he also knew there came a point when silence could no longer be an option. Tonight, that point was drawing closer with every minute that passed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jack approached his table once more. This time, there was no pretense of courtesy in his demeanor. He placed a small breadbasket on the table with an almost dismissive flick of his wrist and gave Malcolm a tight-lipped smirk. "Still waiting on that lamb, huh?" Jack said, his voice thick with condescension. "Might take a while." Malcolm's eyes met Jack's, the calm intensity of his gaze steady and unwavering. For a moment there was no sound, but the faint murmur of the other diners and the soft clink of silverware. Jack's smirk faltered slightly as he realized Malcolm wasn't going to play along with his game. "That's fine. Malcolm said evenly, refusing to give Jack the reaction he was clearly looking for. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his expression cool, his fingers lightly tapping on the edge of the table. Jack, unsettled by Malcolm's composure, hesitated for a second longer before turning and walking away without another word. As he disappeared into the distance, Malcolm exhaled slowly, allowing the tension in his chest to dissipate. He knew this night was heading toward an inevitable confrontation, and Jack had unknowingly set it in motion. From across the room, Chris reappeared, this time with an apologetic expression etched across his face. He approached the table with a sense of urgency, his footsteps lighter than before, as if he was trying to make up for lost time. "I'm really sorry again, sir," Chris began, his voice filled with genuine concern. "I spoke with the kitchen and your meal will be out shortly. I'm not sure what happened, but I want to make sure you're taken care of." Malcolm nodded, appreciating Chris's effort, even if the situation was beyond his control. "Thank you, Chris," he said, his tone calm but laced with an authority that Chris seemed to recognize. Chris smiled nervously and hurried away, clearly uncomfortable with the brewing tension. As Malcolm watched him go, his mind drifted back to the numerous times he had faced situations like this. Racism wasn't always loud or violent. Often it was quiet, like tonight, subtle, wrapped in the guise of poor service or dismissive attitudes. It was the kind of racism that people like Jack likely didn't even recognize in themselves, but it was just as damaging. Malcolm had spent much of his life fighting against systemic bias, speaking up for those who didn't have the platform to speak for themselves. And now, here he was, in a restaurant filled with the city's wealthy and influential, being treated as though he didn't belong simply because of the color of his skin. The quiet whispers of the other patrons continued to rise, and Malcolm could sense their discomfort growing with each passing minute. It was the kind of tension that made people shift in their seats, glance at each other with nervous curiosity, but still remain silent. Malcolm had seen it countless times before. People who recognized injustice but were too afraid, too unsure, or too apathetic to intervene. Malcolm glanced at his watch again. His food was now significantly late, far beyond what could reasonably be considered an oversight. Jack's avoidance of his table had crossed the line from passive neglect to outright disrespect. And yet, Malcolm remained composed, his mind carefully considering how best to address the situation. At this point, many others would have demanded to see the manager, raised their voices, or made a scene. But Malcolm had never been one to act out of impulse. He had always believed in picking his battles and letting others reveal themselves before deciding how to respond. There was power in restraint, in giving people the opportunity to dig themselves deeper into their own prejudices before delivering the final blow. As the tension in the room continued to grow, Malcolm remained calm, observing the world around him. He could feel the eyes of other diners on him now, curious, confused, perhaps even sympathetic, but none of them spoke up. It was the same story, played out time and again. People witnessed injustice, but it was easier to look away, to pretend it wasn't their business. Finally, Malcolm's patience reached its limit. He raised his hand again, this time with a deliberate, measured motion that caught the attention of a passing waiter. Rachel Price, the restaurant manager, noticed the gesture and quickly made her way over, her face filled with professional concern. Rachel was in her early 40s, dressed impeccably in black, her name tag pinned neatly to her blouse. As she approached Malcolm's table, she could feel the eyes of the entire restaurant on her. This wasn't the kind of situation that typically unfolded in a place like Savory Heights, and the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. "Good evening, sir," Rachel said, her voice polite but tinged with a sense of urgency. "I understand there's been some delay with your order. I'm terribly sorry for any inconvenience." Malcolm looked up at her, his expression calm but firm. "Yes, there has been quite a delay," he replied evenly. But the delay isn't the only issue. The service I've received from one of your staff members has been less than acceptable." Rachel's smile faltered slightly, though she quickly recovered her composure. "I'm very sorry to hear that, sir. I assure you that's not how we conduct business here." "Which staff member are you referring to?" Before Malcolm could answer, Jack, who had been watching from a distance, suddenly approached the table. His expression was one of mild annoyance, as though this situation was nothing more than a small inconvenience in his otherwise smooth evening. He clearly had no idea who he was dealing with. "Is there a problem here?" Jack asked, his voice carrying a dismissive tone. His eyes flicked to Rachel, as if expecting her to back him up. Malcolm turned his attention to Jack, his gaze steady and unreadable. He didn't speak immediately, letting the weight of the moment hang in the air. Rachel, sensing something was off, stepped slightly closer to Jack, as though trying to defuse the situation before it escalated. "There is a problem," Malcolm said, his voice low but cutting through the air like a blade. "The problem is that I've been treated with disrespect since the moment I sat down." Jack opened his mouth to respond, but Malcolm continued, not allowing him the opportunity. "You've made assumptions about me, haven't you?" Malcolm asked, his eyes locking with Jack's. "You decided, based on the way I look, that I don't belong here, that I can't afford to be in this restaurant. Isn't that right?" Jack blinked, clearly caught off guard by Malcolm's directness. His usual smug demeanor began to crumble, though he still tried to maintain control of the situation. "I didn't mean anything by it," Jack muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "I was just doing my job." Malcolm's eyes narrowed slightly, the calm exterior still in place, but with an unmistakable intensity behind his gaze. "If this is how you do your job, then you've clearly misunderstood what it means to serve people." Rachel's face had gone pale, and she could see where this was headed. Her mind raced to find a way to salvage the situation before it got any worse, but it was too late. Jack had already dug himself in too deep, and now he was facing the consequences of his actions. The restaurant had fallen into an uneasy silence. Conversations at nearby tables had slowed to a halt, and the soft clinking of silverware was all but absent as the tension between Malcolm and Jack played out in front of the diners. All eyes were now on them, some filled with curiosity, others with discomfort, but none with enough courage to intervene. The only sound that remained was the low hum of jazz music playing through the speakers, a stark contrast to the mounting conflict. Jack, standing stiffly next to Malcolm's table, blinked rapidly as the weight of Malcolm's words sank in. For a brief moment it was clear that he hadn't expected the situation to escalate this far. He had grown accustomed to getting away with this kind of behavior, a few muttered words, a dismissive attitude here and there, and no one ever called him out on it. But tonight was different. He had misjudged Malcolm entirely, and now he was facing the consequences. "I didn't mean anything by it," Jack repeated, his voice quieter now, tinged with an edge of defensiveness. But the confidence he had displayed earlier was gone, replaced by a creeping sense of realization that he had made a grave mistake. Malcolm, still seated, regarded Jack with the same composed intensity that had unsettled him earlier. There was no need for Malcolm to raise his voice or lash out. His calm, authoritative presence was enough to unnerve Jack, and more importantly, to expose the deeper issue at play. "You didn't mean anything by it?" Malcolm echoed softly, his tone measured but carrying the weight of someone who had endured this treatment too many times before. "That's the problem, Jack. You didn't think. You made assumptions about me without knowing anything about who I am. You saw my skin color, and you decided that I don't belong here, that I couldn't possibly afford to dine at this restaurant." Jack shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Malcolm and Rachel, who stood nearby with an expression of growing concern. Rachel's hands were clasped tightly in front of her normally composed demeanor shaken by the escalating situation. She could sense that this was more than just a simple misunderstanding. It was a moment of reckoning, and how she handled it could define the reputation of her restaurant moving forward. I didn't mean," Jack stammered, but he was cut off by Malcolm, who leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with him. "You didn't mean to disrespect me? Or you didn't mean to get caught?" Malcolm's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it now. He had been patient long enough. "This isn't the first time you've treated someone like this, is it? You've made people feel small before, haven't you? You've judged people because they don't look like you or don't fit into your idea of who belongs here." Jack's face flushed red with embarrassment, and his mouth opened and closed as he struggled to find a response. For the first time, he was truly at a loss. The easy confidence he had carried throughout the night had evaporated, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. The silence in the restaurant deepened. It was as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for what would happen next. Malcolm could feel the weight of their stares, but he didn't allow it to distract him. This moment wasn't about the diners or even about Jack, really. It was about something much larger, a pattern of discrimination that played out every day in subtle, insidious ways. And tonight, Malcolm wasn't going to let it slide. Rachel, sensing that she needed to take control of the situation before it spiraled further, stepped forward, her voice firm but conciliatory. "Senator Wright, I want to personally apologize for what has happened tonight," she said, her tone laced with urgency. "I assure you, this is not how we conduct business at Savory Heights. I will handle this immediately." Malcolm's eyes flicked toward Rachel, acknowledging her apology, but his expression remained unreadable. "An apology is a start, Rachel," he said calmly, "but it's not enough. This isn't just about poor service. This is about the assumptions that your staff make about people like me before we even open our mouths. It's about the way people are treated differently because of the color of their skin, not just in this restaurant, but everywhere." Rachel's face flushed slightly, though she maintained her professionalism. "I understand, Senator, and I will make sure that this is addressed. We will be implementing additional training for our staff to ensure that nothing like this happens again." But Malcolm wasn't finished. He had been polite long enough, and now it was time to speak the truth, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been treated like this. He turned his attention back to Jack, his gaze piercing. "Do you even know who I am, Jack?" Jack's eyes widened slightly. The realization dawned on him that he might have made a grave error. "No," Jack muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't." "I'm Senator Malcolm Wright," Malcolm said, his voice steady but commanding. "And I've spent my entire career fighting for the rights of people who are judged and dismissed just like I've been tonight." A ripple of shock spread through the room. A few of the nearby diners gasped audibly, while others exchanged wide-eyed glances. The whispers that had been muted moments before were now replaced by a thick silence, the weight of Malcolm's identity sinking in like a stone dropped into a pond. Jack's face drained of color, his earlier bravado completely gone. He stood frozen, unable to speak as the full implications of his actions hit him. He had disrespected not just any patron, but a state senator, a man with influence, power, and a reputation for fighting for justice. And now, Jack's careless assumptions had brought him to this moment of public reckoning. Rachel, standing beside Jack, looked as though she might faint. Her carefully constructed mask of professionalism was starting to crack, and she could see the situation spiraling out of control. "Senator Wright," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I had no idea. I'm so incredibly sorry for what has happened. I promise you we will take immediate action. Jack will be dealt with." Malcolm held up his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "This isn't about who I am," he said firmly. It's about what I represent. I'm not the only one this has happened to. I'm not the only black man who has walked into a restaurant like this and been treated as though he doesn't belong. The only difference tonight is that you now realize who I am. But what about all the other people you've dismissed, ignored, or treated with disrespect? What about them? Rachel was visibly shaken now, her hands trembling as she clasped them in front of her. She nodded quickly, trying to salvage what was left of the situation. You're absolutely right, Senator. I assure you, we will make changes. We will provide training to all of our staff to address these issues. Malcolm didn't respond immediately. Instead, he surveyed the room, his gaze sweeping over the other diners who were still watching in silence. Some of them looked away as his eyes passed over them, while others met his gaze with a mixture of sympathy and shame. It was clear that his words had struck a nerve, not just with Rachel and Jack, but with everyone in the room. You see, this is the problem, Malcolm continued, his voice carrying across the room with a calm authority that silenced any lingering whispers. Racism isn't always loud, it isn't always in your face. Sometimes it's quiet. It's the way you're ignored, the way people make assumptions about you before you've even said a word. It's the service that never comes, the side-eye glances, the little comments that cut you down without ever having to be explicit. The room was completely still now. Even the few patrons who had continued eating had set their utensils down, their attention fully focused on Malcolm. His words hung heavily in the air, a stark contrast to the easy, luxurious atmosphere that had filled the restaurant earlier. The truth he was speaking was undeniable, and everyone in the room was forced to confront it. Jack shifted uneasily, his eyes darting toward the floor. He looked like a man who wanted to disappear, to shrink away from the confrontation that had exposed his own biases so completely. His earlier arrogance had dissolved, replaced by the realization that he was now the face of the very thing Malcolm had spent his life fighting against. Malcolm took a deep breath, his voice softening slightly, but the weight of his words remained. Jack, this isn't just about you. It's not even about this one night. This is about a larger problem, one that affects people of color every day. The assumptions you made about me tonight, the way you treated me, that's part of something much bigger. Jack's face flushed red with shame, and his hands clenched tightly at his sides. I'm sorry, he muttered again, though the words sounded hollow, more out of fear than genuine remorse. Malcolm regarded him for a moment, his expression thoughtful but firm. Sorry isn't enough, Jack. It's not enough to apologize after the fact. You have to understand why what you did was wrong. You have to recognize the biases you carry and work to change them. Rachel stepped forward again, her face pale but determined. Senator, we will make sure that Jack understands. We will provide him with the necessary training, and we will take steps to ensure that this never happens again. I give you my word. Malcolm nodded slowly, though his expression remained guarded. He had heard these promises before, well-meaning apologies followed by corporate pledges to do better. But too often, those promises faded away after the immediate crisis had passed, leaving the underlying problems intact. We'll see, Malcolm said quietly, his tone neutral, but filled with a deep understanding of how these things typically played out. He didn't need to say more. The implications were clear. He had no interest in free meals or superficial apologies. What he wanted was accountability, real, lasting change. Rachel nodded quickly, sensing the gravity of the situation. I assure you, Senator, we will act immediately. This is not something we take lightly. The tension in the room remained thick, but it was beginning to shift. Malcolm could feel the eyes of the other patrons on him, watching closely as the confrontation unfolded. Some of them looked genuinely moved by his words, their expressions reflecting a new understanding of the quiet racism that had played out before their eyes. Others seemed more uncomfortable, as if they wished the confrontation had never happened, as if they preferred to return to their quiet, privileged evening, undisturbed. Malcolm didn't care about their discomfort. This was a moment of reckoning, and he wasn't going to shy away from it. He had spent his entire career fighting for moments like this, moments where the veil of civility was pulled back, exposing the ugly truth that so often went unspoken in places like this. As the silence stretched on, Malcolm finally leaned back in his chair, the weight of the evening settling over him. The confrontation had passed, but the impact lingered, not just for him, but for everyone who had witnessed it. He could feel the exhaustion creeping in now, the familiar weariness that came after every battle he fought, whether in the halls of the capital or in a quiet restaurant like this. Rachel, still standing by his table, seemed at a loss for what more she could say. Her earlier confidence had been replaced by a quiet humility, and Malcolm could see that she understood, at least on some level, the gravity of what had happened tonight. "I hope you do follow through," Malcolm said finally, his voice soft but firm. "Because this isn't just about me. It's about how we treat each other, how we see each other. And that has to change." Rachel nodded, her face solemn. "We will, Senator. I promise you that." With that, she turned to Jack, who was still standing rigidly by the table, his face a mix of shame and regret. "Jack, I think it's best if you head to the back," she said quietly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll handle things from here." Jack glanced at Malcolm one last time, his face pale and drawn. "I'm sorry," he whispered again, though Malcolm didn't respond. There was nothing more to say. Jack had been exposed to who he was, and now it was up to him to change. As Jack retreated toward the kitchen, the silence in the restaurant remained heavy, with both judgment and introspection. The diners who had witnessed the exchange were left to grapple with their own discomfort, their own biases, as they returned to their meals, though the mood in the room had shifted irrevocably. Malcolm watched Jack disappear into the distance, his posture slumped in defeat. The battle was over for now, but the fight against the deeper systemic racism that had led to this moment was far from finished. He knew that better than anyone. The tension in the restaurant lingered like a thick fog, refusing to dissipate even after Jack had slunk off toward the kitchen. The whispers that had filled the room earlier had quieted, replaced by a heavy silence as the weight of what had just transpired settled in. The diners, many of whom had initially been lost in their own private conversations, were now fully aware of the confrontation they had just witnessed. Some glanced nervously in Malcolm's direction, others stared at their plates, unwilling to meet his gaze. Malcolm took a deep breath, the tightness in his chest slowly beginning to ease as he leaned back in his chair. He had kept his composure throughout the exchange, as he always did, but the emotional toll of moments like these was undeniable. There was a certain kind of exhaustion that came with constantly having to confront racism, always being expected to respond with calm and grace in the face of blatant disrespect. Tonight had been no different. Though he had stayed composed, the weight of Jack's casual racism, of Rachel's corporate apology, and of the silent judgment from the other diners pressed down on him like an invisible burden. It was a burden he had carried for much of his life, one that he had grown used to, but one that still left him weary. As the other patrons slowly resumed their meals, Malcolm remained seated, his thoughts swirling with the familiar frustrations that often accompanied these moments. He had handled the situation the way he always did, with patience, dignity, and restraint. But inside, he couldn't help but feel a gnawing sense of disillusionment. How many more times would he have to face this? How many more quiet dinners would be interrupted by the need to defend his dignity against someone's ignorance? It wasn't just the overt acts of racism that wore him down, but the subtle, insidious moments like these, the microaggressions, the dismissive glances, the unspoken judgments. It was tiring. Being a public figure came with its own set of expectations, and Malcolm had always understood that. As a state senator, he was constantly in the public eye, always aware that his actions were scrutinized more closely than others. He knew he had to be careful about how he responded to these situations. One wrong move, one outburst, and the media would paint him as angry, unreasonable, or worse. So he kept his cool. He stayed composed, but the pressure to always be the bigger person was relentless. As Malcolm sat quietly at his table, his phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced down at the screen to see a familiar name flashing. David Jones. David had been one of Malcolm's closest friends since their college days. Like Malcolm, David was deeply involved in the fight for civil rights and social justice, though his activism often took a more direct, grassroots approach. Where Malcolm worked through legislation and policy, David was out on the streets organizing protests and speaking out on the front lines of change. Malcolm picked up the phone and pressed it into his ear. "Malcolm, man, I just saw what happened." David's voice came through, a mix of concern and frustration evident in his tone. "Are you all right?" Malcolm smiled faintly at the sound of his friend's voice, grateful for the connection. "I'm fine," he replied, though his voice was laced with fatigue. "It's just the same old story, you know." "I know," David said, his tone softening. "I saw the video. Someone in the restaurant must have recorded the whole thing. It's already making the rounds online." Of course, Malcolm thought. It was the age of smartphones and social media. It wasn't surprising that someone had captured the confrontation. It was only a matter of time before it became a talking point in the news cycle. "And how's it being framed?" Malcolm asked, though he already knew the answer. David sighed. "So far, the responses are mixed. Some people praise you for how you handled it. Others are saying you were too harsh on the waiter, that it was just a misunderstanding." Malcolm shook his head. It was always the same. No matter how calmly or respectfully he addressed the situation, there were always people who rushed to defend the perpetrator, downplaying racism as a mere misunderstanding. They refused to see the patterns, the way these moments stacked up over a lifetime, eroding one's sense of belonging and self-worth. "You know how it is," David continued. "There are people who get it, who understand what you were fighting against tonight, but then there are the others, the ones who refuse to see it for what it is. They'll never understand what it feels like to walk into a room and be judged before you've even spoken a word." Malcolm nodded, even though David couldn't see him. "Yeah," he murmured. "It's exhausting." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before David spoke again, his voice filled with a quiet but unwavering resolve. "I know it is, Malcolm, and I know how tired you are. But we have to keep fighting. We don't have the luxury of giving up, not when there's still so much work to be done." Malcolm closed his eyes for a moment, letting David's words sink in. He knew his friend was right. The fight for justice, for equality, was far from over, and despite the weariness that clung to him, he couldn't afford to stop. Too many people were counting on him, not just as a senator, but as a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. "I hear you, David," Malcolm said finally, his voice carrying a renewed sense of determination. "We keep fighting." David chuckled softly, a hint of warmth returning to his voice. "That's the Malcolm I know. You need anything? I'm here, man. Always." "I know," Malcolm replied, grateful for his friend's support. "Thanks, David. I'll call you later." As he hung up the phone, Malcolm sat in silence for a moment longer, the weariness still present but tempered now by the knowledge that he wasn't alone in this fight. He had allies, friends who understood the struggle and were willing to stand beside him, but even with that support, Malcolm couldn't ignore the toll it took on him personally. Every confrontation, every moment of subtle racism chipped away at him bit by bit. He had spent years fighting these battles, and though he had achieved much both for himself and for the causes he championed, that he knew the fight was far from over. Tonight had been a stark reminder of that. Across the room, Malcolm noticed the other diners had resumed their meals, though the atmosphere was noticeably different. The light-hearted laughter and easy conversations that had filled the restaurant earlier had been replaced by a more subdued tone. He could see it in the way people sat, the way they avoided eye contact with him. They had witnessed the confrontation, and now they were grappling with their own discomfort, their own complicity in the quiet racism that permeated spaces like this. Some of them had looked away when Jack had disrespected Malcolm, unwilling to speak up or get involved. Now those same patrons sat in silence, their forks moving slowly, their eyes flicking occasionally in his direction. He wondered how many of them would leave this restaurant and forget what they had seen. How many would return to their comfortable lives, content to believe that racism was someone else's problem. Malcolm knew that real change didn't come easily. It wasn't something that happened overnight or with a single confrontation. It took time, persistence, and the willingness to challenge deeply ingrained beliefs. But as much as he believed in the fight, as much as he was committed to it, there were moments, like tonight, when the burden felt almost too heavy to bear. Just then, Rachel returned to his table. Her face was still pale, but her posture was more composed. She approached slowly, her hands clasped in front of her, as if she were preparing herself for another round of apologies. "Senator Wright," she began, her voice measured, "I want to again express my deepest apologies for what happened tonight. This isn't how we want to represent our restaurant, and I can't tell you how sorry I am." Malcolm looked up at her, his expression calm but unreadable. "I appreciate the apology," he said, though his tone carried the weight of someone who had heard similar words too many times before. "But apologies aren't enough, Rachel. What matters is what happens next." Rachel nodded quickly, clearly eager to show that she understood. "I've already spoken with the owner of the restaurant, and we're taking immediate steps to ensure that this doesn't happen again. We're going to implement mandatory training for all of our staff. Training on racial bias, inclusivity, and how to treat every customer with the respect they deserve." Malcolm regarded her for a moment, his eyes searching her face for signs of sincerity. He had heard these promises before, from other restaurants, businesses, and corporations. Too often they were empty gestures, temporary fixes designed to placate the situation without addressing the deeper, systemic issues at play. "That's a good start," Malcolm said finally, his voice neutral but firm. "But it can't just be a one-time thing. Training won't fix the problem unless it's ongoing, unless it becomes part of the culture." Rachel nodded again, this time more slowly. "I understand, Senator, and I promise you, we're committed to making real changes. This isn't just about avoiding bad press. It's about doing what's right." Malcolm studied her for another moment, sensing the urgency in her words. He could tell that she genuinely wanted to make things right, that she understood the gravity of the situation. But he also knew that real change was slow and often difficult to achieve. "We'll see," he said quietly, his tone carrying both a warning and a hope. Rachel offered him a small, respectful nod before excusing herself, leaving Malcolm alone once again. As she walked away, he could see the weight of the evening pressing down on her shoulders, her steps more measured and thoughtful than before. Perhaps tonight would lead to change, perhaps his words, his actions had made an impact, but Malcolm knew better than to assume that one confrontation would be enough. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a long, slow breath. The weariness was still there, heavy and undeniable, but there was also a sense of resolve. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but tonight had been one small victory in a much larger battle. As Malcolm sat in the dim light of the restaurant, the murmurs of conversation slowly returning around him, he allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He had done what he could tonight. He had spoken the truth, exposed the quiet racism that had been allowed to fester in this space. Now it was up to Rachel, to the restaurant, and to the other diners to decide how they would respond. And yet, despite the exhaustion, Malcolm felt a flicker of hope. He had fought this battle countless times before, and he knew he would fight it again. But tonight, he had reminded everyone in that room, including himself, that silence was not an option, that real change required not just words, but action. As the night stretched on and the restaurant began to empty out, Malcolm gathered his things and prepared to leave. The cool night air outside called to him, offering a brief respite from the tension that had filled the evening. He knew that when he stepped out of this restaurant, the fight would continue. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing that he had done what was necessary. Tomorrow, the battle will begin anew. But tonight, he had stood his ground, and that was enough. Malcolm stepped out of the restaurant, feeling the cool night air wash over him. It was a welcome contrast to the heat and tension that had filled the dining room. For a moment, he simply stood on the sidewalk, his breath visible in the chill as he looked out over the city. The lights of Washington, D.C. twinkled in the distance, and the soft hum of traffic and voices provided a quiet soundtrack to his thoughts. The events of the evening played over in his mind, the confrontation with Jack and Rachel, the silence of the other patrons, the weariness that had settled deep in his bones. It wasn't just about tonight. It never was. Every moment like this was connected to a lifetime of experiences that came from being a black man in America. Malcolm had built his career on addressing those experiences, turning his personal frustrations into public advocacy. But that didn't make the burden any lighter. As he stood there watching the world pass by, his phone buzzed again. He pulled it from his pocket, expecting another call from David or a colleague checking in after the incident, but this time it wasn't a call. It was a series of notifications: Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. The video David mentioned was spreading faster than Malcolm had anticipated. He unlocked his phone and opened one of the notifications. It was a link to a video that had already garnered thousands of views. The video showed a shaky but clear recording of his confrontation with Jack at the restaurant. The camera captured everything: the quiet disdain in Jack's voice, Malcolm's calm but powerful response, and the shocked reactions of the other patrons. The caption below the video read, "State Senator Malcolm Wright confronts waiters' racism, a lesson in grace and power." Malcolm exhaled slowly, scrolling through the comments. As David had warned, the responses were mixed. Some praised Malcolm for his composure and for speaking out against the casual racism that had played out in front of the entire restaurant. Senator Wright handled that with such class. This is what leadership looks like. People need to see this. Racism isn't always overt, but it's just as damaging when it's subtle. Malcolm Wright is a hero. He didn't raise his voice, but he still spoke volumes. But, as always, there were others who sought to downplay the incident, to frame it as a misunderstanding, or worse, to blame Malcolm for escalating the situation. This was blown way out of proportion. The waiter didn't mean anything by it. "I'm tired of people playing the race card every time something goes wrong. He's a senator. Why is he making such a big deal out of a simple mistake? Get over it." Malcolm shook his head, unsurprised by the negative comments. He had long since grown used to the way these moments were twisted by those who refused to confront the reality of racism. To them, any mention of racial bias was an overreaction. Any call for accountability was seen as playing the race card. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call from his communications director, Julia Perkins. Julia had been with Malcolm for years, helping him navigate the media, especially when it came to sensitive issues like this. "Julia," Malcolm said as he answered the call, "I assume you've seen the video." "I've seen it," Julia replied, her voice calm but focused. "It's spreading fast. News outlets are already picking it up. We're going to need to address this publicly." Malcolm ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. He had known this was coming. Ever since the confrontation had ended, he had known that this wouldn't stay confined to the restaurant. It was too public, too raw. People were going to talk about it, dissect it, and turn it into a conversation about race and power, whether he liked it or not. "What's the general reaction?" Malcolm asked, even though he had already seen it for himself. Julia hesitated for a moment before answering, "It's about what you'd expect. There are a lot of people praising you for how you handled it. They're saying it's a powerful moment that sheds light on the subtle racism that still exists in places like that. But of course there are detractors too, people saying you were overreacting, that it wasn't really about race, that it was just a bad waiter having a bad night." Malcolm sighed. "And what do you think?" Julia was quiet for a beat, then she spoke with the steady confidence that Malcolm had always admired in her. "I think you did the right thing. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't lash out. You spoke the truth, and people need to hear it, but we need to be careful with how we respond to this. The media is going to try to spin this in different directions, and we need to stay ahead of it." Malcolm nodded, even though Julia couldn't see him. "I hear you. What's the plan?" "I've already drafted a statement," Julia said, her tone crisp and professional. "We'll release it in the morning, addressing the incident head-on. You're going to be asked to comment on this, probably in multiple interviews. We can use this moment to talk about the broader issues, racism in public spaces, the need for accountability, all of it. But you'll need to decide how far you want to take it. This could become a much larger conversation, and you'll be at the center of it." Malcolm knew what Julia was getting at. This incident could become a flashpoint in the larger conversation about race in America. He could use his platform to shine a light on the quiet racism that played out in restaurants, businesses, and public spaces across the country. But that also meant putting himself at the forefront of the conversation, opening himself up to even more scrutiny, more attacks from those who refused to acknowledge the problem. He had been here before, after every major public confrontation, after every speech he gave about systemic racism. There were always people who tried to tear him down. They accused him of being too radical, too focused on race, too divisive. And each time, Malcolm had to decide whether the fight was worth it. This time, he knew it was. "Let's do it," Malcolm said, his voice firm. "Let's use this moment. We can't let it slip away." Julia didn't miss a beat. "I'll get everything ready. We'll release the statement first thing in the morning, and I'll start lining up interviews. This could be big, Malcolm. We need to make sure we're ready for whatever comes next." "I'm ready," Malcolm replied, though he felt the familiar weariness creeping in again. It wasn't just about tonight. This was about something much larger, something he had been fighting for his entire career. As he hung up the phone, Malcolm turned and walked toward his car. The night was quiet, the city lights casting long shadows across the pavement. He knew that tomorrow everything would change. The incident at the restaurant would no longer be a private moment of quiet confrontation. It would become a public battle, one that would spill into the national conversation about race and justice. But that was tomorrow. For now, Malcolm allowed himself a moment of solitude as he drove through the city streets, the weight of what was to come settling over him. The following morning, the sun had barely risen over the horizon when Malcolm's phone began to buzz with a steady stream of notifications. The video from the restaurant had gained even more traction overnight, with major news outlets picking it up and amplifying the conversation. By the time Malcolm arrived at his office, The story had already become a trending topic on social media, with the hashtags #Grace Under Fire and #Silent Racism gaining momentum. Julia was waiting for him in his office. Her laptop opened in front of her as she reviewed the latest headlines. "Morning, Senator," she said, standing to greet him. "We've got a lot to cover today." Malcolm nodded, sitting down at his desk and glancing at the various articles that Julia had pulled up on her screen. The headlines varied, but they all revolved around the same theme. State Senator confronts racism in upscale D.C. Restaurant, a call for change. Grace and composure. Malcolm writes, poised response to racism goes viral. Was it really racism? The debate over Senator Wright's restaurant incident. Julia clicked through the articles as she summarized the latest developments. Most of the major networks are running the story now, and we've got interview requests from CNN, MSNBC, and a few local outlets. I've also had a few requests from podcasts and online platforms. Everyone wants your take on what happened. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his mind racing as he considered the implications. This was exactly what Julia had predicted. The incident had blown up, and now the media was eager to turn it into a larger conversation. But Malcolm knew that the way he framed the narrative would be crucial. He didn't want this to become a spectacle. He wanted it to spark real dialogue about the deeper issues at play. "What's our approach?" Malcolm asked, looking up at Julia. "I think we lead with the facts," Julia said, scrolling through her notes. "You speak to what happened, but then pivot to the broader issue of racism in public spaces. You've already done this in your legislative work. This is just an opportunity to bring more attention to it. We can use this moment to push for change, but we have to be careful not to get bogged down in the details of the restaurant incident itself. This isn't just about one waiter at one restaurant. It's about a pattern of behavior that's been allowed to persist for far too long." Malcolm nodded in agreement. He had always believed in focusing on the bigger picture. Yes, the incident at Savory Heights was significant, but it was only one example of the quiet racism that played out in restaurants, businesses, and public spaces across the country. If this moment was going to mean something, it had to be about more than just him. "We'll release the statement in an hour," Julia continued, "and then we'll start preparing for the interviews. You've got one lined up with CNN this afternoon, and I'll handle the rest of the scheduling." Malcolm appreciated Julia's efficiency. She had always been one step ahead, anticipating what needed to be done before he even asked. It was one of the reasons he trusted her so much. She understood the stakes, both politically and personally. As the morning passed, Malcolm reviewed the statement Julia had prepared. It was straightforward, addressing the incident at the restaurant while emphasizing the need for broader conversations about race, bias, and accountability. He made a few small adjustments, adding his personal reflections on how these moments impacted people of color on a daily basis. By noon, the statement was live, and the media frenzy intensified. Reporters from every major network were calling, eager for a soundbite, a quote, or a comment from Malcolm. Julia expertly navigated the requests, ensuring that Malcolm's message remained clear and focused. A few days later, Malcolm found himself standing backstage at a large community forum on racial justice. The forum had been planned weeks ago as part of a series of discussions on systemic racism, but after the restaurant incident, the organizers had reached out to Malcolm, inviting him to be the keynote speaker. It was an opportunity to take the conversation beyond the viral video and into a broader public space. As Malcolm waited for his introduction, he felt a familiar mix of anticipation and resolve. He had spoken at countless events like this before, but there was something different about tonight. The energy in the room was palpable, charged by the viral video and the ongoing media coverage. People weren't just here to listen. They were here to engage, to be part of the conversation. "Ladies and gentlemen," the moderator's voice boomed from the stage, "please welcome our keynote speaker, Senator Malcolm Wright." The audience erupted into applause as Malcolm stepped out onto the stage, the bright lights temporarily blinding him. He could see the silhouettes of the crowd in front of him. Hundreds of people, some holding signs, others wearing shirts emblazoned with messages of justice and equality. Malcolm took a deep breath and approached the podium, his hands resting lightly on the edges as he began to speak. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Thank you for being here tonight, for being part of this conversation. What happened at the restaurant a few nights ago is just one example of a much larger issue, one that affects people of color every single day, in ways that are often invisible to those who don't experience it." The room fell silent, the audience hanging on his every word. "We live in a country where racism doesn't always show itself in obvious ways," Malcolm continued. "It's not always someone shouting slurs or committing acts of violence. Sometimes it's much quieter. It's the assumptions people make about you before you've even spoken. It's the way you're treated differently because of the color of your skin. It's the service that never comes, the opportunities that are denied, the doors that are closed before you even have a chance to knock." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "What happened at that restaurant wasn't an isolated incident," Malcolm said, his voice growing stronger. "It's part of a pattern that plays out in businesses, schools, and communities across this country. And if we want to change that, we have to be willing to confront it head on. We have to be willing to speak up, to call it out when we see it, and to demand better from the people and institutions around us." The audience erupted into applause, some people rising to their feet as they cheered Malcolm on. But as the noise died down, a voice from the back of the room called out, cutting through the applause. "What about accountability, Senator?" The voice belonged to Lena Bryant, a young activist who had been making waves in the community for her outspoken approach to social justice. "What happens to the people who get away with this kind of behavior? How do we hold them accountable?" Malcolm looked out at Lena, his eyes meeting hers across the room. He had followed her work closely, admired her passion and commitment to change, but he also knew that she represented a more radical approach, one that didn't always align with his methods of working within the system. "That's a great question," Malcolm said, his voice calm but firm. "Accountability is critical. But we also have to recognize that change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time. It takes persistence. We can hold people accountable, yes, but we also have to create spaces where people can learn, where they can grow and understand the harm they've caused." Lena crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. "But how do we know they're actually learning? How do we know they won't just go back to the same behavior once the cameras are off and the media stops paying attention?" Malcolm considered her words carefully before responding. "We can't always know for sure, but that doesn't mean we stop trying. We have to keep pushing for accountability, but we also have to be willing to educate, to give people the opportunity to change. It's not about letting them off the hook, it's about recognizing that change is a process and it's our responsibility to lead that process." Lena didn't look entirely convinced, but she nodded, acknowledging Malcolm's point. The room was quiet now, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. Malcolm took a deep breath, knowing that the moment of confrontation was an important one. Lena represented the frustration that so many people felt, the anger at a system that seemed designed to protect those who perpetuated racism. And while Malcolm understood that frustration, he also believed that real change required a balance of grace and accountability. "Look," Malcolm said, his voice soft but strong, "I'm not here to tell you that change is easy. It's not. It's hard, and it's slow, and sometimes it feels like we're not making progress at all. But I've spent my entire career fighting for that change, and I can tell you this: every step forward, no matter how small, matters. Every conversation, every moment of accountability, every act of courage, all adds up. And if we keep pushing, if we keep demanding better, we will see the change we're fighting for. The room erupted into applause again, the energy even higher than before. Malcolm could feel the momentum building, the sense that this conversation was just the beginning of something much larger. As the applause died down, Malcolm stepped back from the podium, feeling both the weight of the moment and the promise of what was to come. The applause from the forum still echoed in Malcolm's mind as he sat alone in his office later that evening, the quiet hum of the city just beyond the window. His speech had been well received, the crowd's energy palpable, but the exchange with Lena Bryant had left him unsettled. He couldn't shake the feeling that her challenge had resonated with more people than just the young activist herself. There was a hunger in the air, a demand for change that went beyond polite conversations and corporate promises. Lena's words had struck at the core of something Malcolm had wrestled with for years. Was he doing enough? Was his approach, working within the system, advocating for incremental change, still the best way forward? He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion settling into his bones as he leaned back in his chair. The weight of years of public service, of carrying the expectations of a community, of a movement, was heavy tonight. He had chosen the path of diplomacy, of patience, because he believed that change required time. But there was a growing impatience among the younger generation of activists, people like Lena, who wanted faster, more immediate results. They weren't wrong to demand that. In fact, Malcolm understood their frustration all too well. His phone buzzed on the desk, pulling him from his thoughts. A quick glance at the screen revealed a text from David. "David, saw the forum. You handled it well, but Lena made some points." "People are fired up," Malcolm sighed and typed out a reply. "Malcolm, I know. It's not easy to keep the balance." David's response came quickly. "David, you've been in this game a long time, but things are shifting. You might need to adapt." Malcolm stared at the screen for a moment, letting David's words sink in. Was he stuck in his way? Had his approach, honed over decades of experience, become too cautious about the times they were living in? He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city. The light stretched out in front of him, the same city he had served for years, but it felt different tonight. The world was changing, and Malcolm knew he had to find a way to change with it, or risk becoming irrelevant to the movement he had helped build. By the next morning, the forum had sparked new debates online, with social media buzzing about Malcolm's exchange with Lena. The viral video from the restaurant was still circulating, but now it has taken on a different tone. Commentators and pundits were weighing in on the deeper issues Malcolm had raised in his speech, but they were also questioning his approach. Is Malcolm Wright too patient for today's fight? Activists demand more. Is Senator Wright out of touch with the new generation of changemakers? Lena Bryant's challenge: is incremental change enough in the fight against racism? Malcolm scrolled through the headlines, his heart heavy with the realization that the conversation was shifting. He had always known that younger activists would eventually push for more radical approaches, but he hadn't expected the moment to come so soon, or so publicly. His phone buzzed again, and this time it was Julia. "Malcolm, we need to talk about Lena," she said as soon as he picked up the call. Malcolm sighed. "I know. She's not going away, is she?" "No," Julia replied, her voice firm. "And honestly, she shouldn't. She struck a chord with people. They're listening to her, and now the media is picking up on it." Malcolm sat down at his desk, leaning forward as he listened. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we get ahead of this," Julia said. "There's an event happening tomorrow. A panel on racial justice. Lena is scheduled to be there, and I think you should be too. Malcolm hesitated. You want me to debate her? That's not going to go over well. It'll look like I'm trying to shut her down. No, Julia said quickly. Not a debate. A conversation. This is an opportunity to show that you're not just some out-of-touch politician clinging to old methods. You need to show that you're willing to listen, to engage with the new generation. If we handle this right, it could be a turning point. Malcolm knew Julia was right. The political landscape was changing, and he couldn't afford to be seen as rigid or resistant to new ideas. He had always prided himself on being a man of the people, but if he was going to maintain that reputation, he needed to engage with the younger activists who were now driving the conversation. All right, Malcolm said finally. Set it up. I'll be there. The next day, Malcolm arrived at the event, held in a large community center that had been transformed into a forum for discussion on racial justice. The room was packed with activists, community leaders, and members of the media, all waiting for the panel to begin. There was a sense of anticipation in the air. People knew that the conversation between Malcolm and Lena was going to be a pivotal moment. As Malcolm took his seat on stage, he glanced at the other panelists. Lena sat directly across from him, her expression serious but focused. She wore a t-shirt with the words "No Justice, No Peace" emblazoned across the front, and her posture radiated the kind of confidence that came with youth and conviction. The moderator, a local journalist named Aaron Flores, stepped up to the podium and introduced the panel, briefly summarizing the viral video that had brought Malcolm into the spotlight and the growing movement led by Lena and other young activists. Tonight, we're here to have an honest conversation about the fight for racial justice, Aaron said. Senator Wright, you've been a leader in this movement for decades. Lena, you've become a voice for a new generation of activists. Let's start by talking about where we are now and where we need to go from here. Malcolm leaned forward, ready to engage. He knew that the audience was expecting tension, maybe even conflict, but he was determined to make this a constructive conversation. Thank you, Aaron, Malcolm began, his voice steady. I've spent my career fighting for justice, for equality. And while we've made progress, there's no question that we still have a long way to go. What happened at the restaurant was just one example of the quiet racism that permeates our society, and I'm committed to continuing the fight against it. He paused, glancing at Lena. But I also recognize that the fight is changing. New voices are emerging, and I'm here tonight to listen, to learn, and to engage with those voices, the audience murmured in response, clearly intrigued by Malcolm's willingness to engage directly with Lena. For her part, Lena didn't waste any time in responding. I respect the work you've done, Senator, Lena said, her tone measured but firm. But the problem is that people like me, people from my generation, are tired of waiting. We're tired of incremental change. We're tired of being told to be patient while people like Jack, she paused, referring to the waiter from the restaurant incident, continue to get away with their quiet racism. We need real accountability, and we need it now. Malcolm nodded, understanding her frustration. I hear you, Lena, and I agree that accountability is critical. But we also have to recognize that change doesn't happen overnight. We have to build the structures that will support lasting change, not just temporary fixes. Lena leaned forward, her eyes flashing with passion. But that's the problem, Senator. Those structures are built on systems that are already broken. We can't wait for them to be reformed from the inside. We need to dismantle them and start over. The room went still, the tension between Malcolm's pragmatic approach and Lena's more radical vision hanging in the air. Malcolm could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, and for a moment he wasn't sure how to respond. He knew that Lena's vision was compelling, but he also knew that tearing down systems without a plan for what came next could lead to chaos. You're right that the system is flawed, Malcolm said carefully, But if we tear it down without a plan for what comes next, we risk leaving a vacuum that could be filled with something worse. We need to fight for change, yes, but we need to do it in a way that ensures stability, that ensures progress won't be undone by the next election cycle. Lena shook her head, clearly unconvinced. But that's just another way of saying we need to wait. And people like me, like the ones in this room, are done waiting. The audience erupted into applause, many of them clearly aligned with Lena's sense of urgency. Malcolm felt the pressure of the moment, but he didn't back down. "I understand the need for urgency," Malcolm said, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the crowd. "But I also understand that change is a process. It's not about waiting, it's about building a foundation for lasting change. We can demand accountability now, but we also need to think about what comes next." The applause quieted as Malcolm continued, his voice filled with conviction. "The fight for justice is a long one, and we can't afford to lose sight of the bigger picture. Yes, we need accountability. Yes, we need change now, but we also need to make sure that the change we create is sustainable, that it lasts beyond this moment." Lena crossed her arms, her expression still defiant, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. She wasn't entirely convinced, but she was listening. The moderator, sensing the tension between the two, stepped in to guide the conversation. "Lena, Senator Wright has talked about the need for both urgency and sustainability. How do you see those two things coexisting?" Lena hesitated for a moment before responding. "I think we can have both, but only if we're willing to take risks. We can't just keep playing it safe. We need to push harder, demand more, and hold people accountable, even if it makes them uncomfortable." The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement, and Malcolm could feel the momentum shifting toward Lena's vision of bold, immediate action. But he wasn't ready to concede. He had spent too many years in this fight to believe that tearing down the system without a plan was the answer. "Change always comes with risk," Malcolm said, his voice calm but firm. "But we have to make sure that the risks we take are calculated, that they lead us to a better future, not one filled with uncertainty." He paused, looking directly at Lena. "I'm not asking for patience, I'm asking for strategy, for us to work together to build something lasting." The room fell silent as Malcolm's words settled over the audience. Lena didn't respond right away, but Malcolm could see that his words had reached her, at least on some level. After a long pause, Lena spoke again, her voice softer now. "I get that, Senator. I really do. But we're in a crisis. People are dying. People are being left behind by a system that doesn't care about them. We don't have time to wait for the perfect strategy." Malcolm nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. "You're right. We are in a crisis, and that's why we need to be smart about how we move forward. We need to fight with everything we have, but we also need to make sure that what we build will stand the test of time." The tension in the room began to ease as the conversation shifted from conflict to collaboration. The audience was no longer just watching a debate. They were witnessing a dialogue between two generations of activists, each with their own vision of how to achieve justice. Malcolm could feel the energy in the room shifting, the applause that followed no longer just for Lena or for him, but for the possibility of working together toward a common goal. The auditorium had emptied out, the energy from the evening's panel slowly dissipating into the quiet of the night. Malcolm lingered on the stage, watching as the last of the audience members filed out through the double doors, their voices echoing faintly in the corridor. Lena had left quickly after the event, offering Malcolm a polite but reserved nod before she disappeared into the crowd. There had been no dramatic reconciliation, no moment of complete understanding. But Malcolm wasn't disheartened. The exchange between them had been raw, honest, and necessary. As the room emptied, Malcolm was left with the quiet hum of his own thoughts. The dialogue with Lena had forced him to confront questions he had been avoiding for some time. Was his approach still effective in a world that demanded more immediate change? Was he, as some of his critics had suggested, too patient, too embedded in the system to truly push for the kind of transformation people like Lena were fighting for? He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the years he had spent in this fight pressing down on him. It wasn't that he didn't believe in the cause anymore. He believed in it more than ever. But he was beginning to understand that the methods he had relied on might not be enough in the face of the growing urgency. The world was changing, and Malcolm knew he needed to find a way to change with it. Julia approached him from the side of the stage, her face a mix of concern and quiet admiration. "You handled that well, Malcolm," she said, offering him a small smile. "Lena's tough, but I think you got through to her." Malcolm nodded, though his thoughts were still swirling. "Maybe," he replied, his voice distant, "but she got through to me too." Julia raised an eyebrow, surprised by the admission. "What do you mean?" Malcolm sighed, running a hand through his hair as he considered his next words. "I mean, she's right, at least in some ways. People like Lena are tired of waiting, and I can't blame them. I've been telling them for years that change takes time, that we have to work within the system. But the system is broken. It's slow, it's resistant to change, and sometimes it feels like we're not making progress fast enough." Julia regarded him carefully, sensing the weight of his reflection. "You've accomplished so much, Malcolm. You've pushed for legislation. You've led the fight for civil rights. You're not part of the problem." Malcolm shook his head, a faint smile touching his lips. "I'm not saying I am, but I also can't ignore the fact that there's a growing divide between people like me who've been in this fight for decades and the new generation who want to see results now. I'm starting to wonder if there's a way to bridge that gap." Julia placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "If anyone can do it, it's you. You've always found a way to bring people together, to balance progress with patience." Malcolm appreciated her words, but he knew that this was different. The tension between him and Lena wasn't just about strategy. It was about generational change. The world was moving faster, and Malcolm had to figure out how to keep up. "I'll need to think about it," Malcolm said quietly, standing and gathering his things. "We've got a lot of work to do." Julia nodded, falling into step beside him as they left the auditorium. "You're right. But tonight was a step in the right direction. You didn't shut her down. You didn't dismiss her concerns. That's more than a lot of people in your position would have done." Malcolm chuckled softly. "The bar's pretty low, huh?" Julia smiled. "Maybe. But that doesn't mean your efforts don't matter." They walked in silence for a few moments before Malcolm spoke again. "I need to meet with Lena. Just the two of us. We've got more to talk about, and I don't want it to happen in front of a crowd. This can't just be about winning debates." Julia paused for a moment, considering the idea. "I can set that up. But I'll be honest, Malcolm. Lena's not the kind of person who's easily swayed. She's passionate, and she's not afraid to push back." "I know," Malcolm replied. "That's exactly why I need to talk to her." A few days later, Malcolm found himself sitting at a small cafe in the heart of the city, waiting for Lena to arrive. The cafe was modest but cozy, filled with the quiet hum of conversation and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. It was a stark contrast to the tension of the panel, a space that felt more intimate, more conducive to honest dialogue. Lena arrived a few minutes later, her expression cautious but not hostile. She took a seat across from Malcolm, glancing around the cafe before turning her attention to him. "Thanks for meeting with me," Malcolm said, offering her a genuine smile. I know things got a little heated the other night, but I wanted to continue the conversation. Lena shrugged, her face unreadable. I'm not one to back down from a fight, but I appreciate you reaching out. A lot of people in your position would have just ignored me. Malcolm nodded. That's part of the problem, though, isn't it? Too many people dismiss what you're fighting for because they think they know better. I don't want to be one of those people. Lena leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. So what do you want, Senator? You've been in this game for a long time. You've worked inside the system, and I get that. But people like me, we're done waiting. We're done with compromises that don't get us anywhere. Malcolm took a sip of his coffee, his eyes meeting hers. I get that. And I'm not here to tell you to be patient. I'm here because I think there's value in both approaches, yours and mine. Lena raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. You think so? Because from where I'm standing, it feels like your approach is just slowing us down. Malcolm didn't flinch at the bluntness of her words. He had expected this. I know it can feel that way. Believe me, I've been frustrated by the slow pace of change too, but we need to be smart about how we move forward. You want to dismantle the system, and I understand why. But we also need to make sure we're not tearing things down without building something better to replace it. Lena sighed, her frustration evident. That's what everyone keeps saying, though, and while we're busy building, people are still suffering. People are still being killed. We don't have time for strategy sessions when lives are on the line. Malcolm nodded, acknowledging the truth in her words. You're right. There's an urgency to this fight that can't be ignored. But there's also a risk in acting without a plan. We need both the urgency to act and the strategy to make sure what we build lasts. We can't afford to lose sight of one for the other. Lena stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than before. You really believe that, don't you? That we can have both? I do, Malcolm said firmly. I've spent my whole life fighting for that balance, and I think we can achieve it, if we work together. Lena considered his words, her gaze thoughtful. It's not that I don't respect what you've done, Senator. I do. But I'm tired of people telling me to wait for change. We've been waiting for too long. Malcolm leaned forward, his voice steady. I'm not asking you to wait. I'm asking you to fight smarter. I'm asking you to work with me, not because I have all the answers, but because together we can push this movement further than either of us could on our own. Lena didn't respond immediately. She looked out the window, her expression contemplative. Finally, she turned back to Malcolm, her eyes meeting him with a newfound sense of understanding. Okay, she said quietly. Let's see what we can do. Together. Over the next few weeks, Malcolm and Lena worked side by side, finding common ground where they had once stood on opposite sides of the ideological divide. They attended community meetings, organized protests, and spoke at rallies, their message unified by the belief that both urgency and strategy were necessary for real, lasting change. The media, once eager to pit them against each other, began to take notice of their collaboration. Headlines shifted from debates over whether Malcolm's approach was outdated to stories of how the generational gap between him and Lena was being bridged for the greater good. 2 generations, one fight. Senator Wright and activist Lena Bryant forged new path forward, from confrontation to collaboration, how Malcolm Wright and Lena Bryant are pushing for change. Malcolm felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was simply reacting to the slow grind of politics. He was part of something bigger, something that blended the best of his experience with the fire of Lena's activism. Together, they were building a movement that wasn't just about incremental change or radical overhaul, but about creating a future where both approaches could coexist. It wasn't easy. There were still disagreements, still moments of tension between their different visions for how to achieve justice. But those moments were now tempered by mutual respect, by the understanding that they were both fighting for the same goal, even if their methods differed. As the weeks went on, Malcolm found himself looking at the future with a new perspective. He had always believed that change was possible, but now he knew that the path forward didn't have to be as rigid as he had once thought. There was room for both patience and urgency, for strategy and bold action, and if he could help guide that balance, he would. One evening, after a long day of meetings and planning sessions, Malcolm found himself sitting alone in his office, the city lights twinkling outside the window. The work was far from over. There were still battles to be fought, still challenges to overcome. But for the first time in a long while, Malcolm felt a sense of peace. He had learned from Lena, just as she had learned from him. Together, they had built something new, something that neither of them could have achieved alone. It was a quiet victory, one that wouldn't make headlines or go viral on social media, but it was a victory nonetheless. As Malcolm sat in the stillness of the night, his phone buzzed with a text from Lena. "Lena, you're not so bad, Senator. Maybe this collaboration thing isn't the worst idea after all." Malcolm smiled, typing a quick response. "Malcolm, glad to hear that. We're just getting started." He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, the weight of the years lifting ever so slightly. The fight would continue, but tonight, Malcolm allowed himself to rest. The months that followed Malcolm's collaboration with Lena brought about a quiet but noticeable shift in the movement for racial justice. Their partnership had inspired many, bridging the gap between older activists who had fought for decades and younger voices pushing for more immediate change. The media buzz had died down, as it always did, but the work behind the scenes continued. The collaboration wasn't a headline anymore. It was a living, breathing effort grounded in community action and legislative progress. Malcolm sat in his office, surrounded by papers, news clippings, and legislative proposals. He had spent the last several weeks drafting new legislation with Lena's input, focusing on accountability in law enforcement, fair housing, and bias in public services. The bills weren't perfect, and Malcolm knew that passing them would take time, but they were a step forward, a tangible result of the balance he and Lena had managed to strike between urgency and strategy. It was late in the evening, and his office was bathed in the soft glow of a single desk lamp. Outside the window, the city buzzed with life, the same city that had seen Malcolm grow from a young law student into a seasoned state senator. He had spent his life fighting for this city, for the people who lived in it, and now, as his career approached its twilight years, he found himself reflecting on what it all meant. There had been victories and setbacks, moments of joy and moments of deep frustration. He had seen laws change, but he had also seen how slowly society followed those changes, and yet, despite the weariness that came with decades of public service, Malcolm felt a sense of peace tonight. He glanced at his phone, which buzzed softly on his desk. It was another text from Lena. "Lena, the housing bill is gaining traction. Meeting with the mayor tomorrow. You in?" Malcolm smiled, typing out a quick response. "Malcolm, I'll be there. Let's make it happen." He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. The work never stopped, but for the first time in years, Malcolm didn't feel like he was carrying the weight alone. Lena and the younger activists had injected new life into the movement. And while their methods were different, their passion had reinvigorated Malcolm in ways he hadn't expected. The door to his office creaked open, and Julia stepped in, holding a stack of papers. "These just came in," she said, placing the stack on his desk. "Updates on the legislation. Some good news. There's bipartisan support for the education reform bill." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "Bipartisan support? Now that's something." Julia grinned. Don't get too excited, it's still going to be a fight, but it's progress. Malcolm chuckled softly. I'll take it. Progress is progress. Julia lingered for a moment, her eyes scanning the clutter of papers and files on Malcolm's desk. You know, she said, her voice softer now, you've done a lot of good, Malcolm. Sometimes I don't think you realize just how much. Malcolm looked up at her, a faint smile on his face. I appreciate that, Julia, but it's not just about what I've done, it's about what comes next. People like Lena, they're the future. They're the ones who will carry this fight forward long after I'm gone. Julia nodded, her expression thoughtful. Maybe so, but they wouldn't have a path to walk if you hadn't paved it. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window. He thought about all the battles he had fought, all the speeches he had given, all the legislation he had helped pass. Julia was right. His work had laid the foundation for a new generation of activists to build upon. But he also knew that the fight wasn't over. It never would be. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, Malcolm said, his voice reflective. Legacy, what we leave behind. It's not just about passing laws or winning elections. It's about changing the way people think, the way they see each other. That's the real fight. Julia sat down in the chair across from him, her eyes soft with understanding. And you've done that, Malcolm. You've changed the way people think. You've made them see what they couldn't or wouldn't see before. Malcolm smiled faintly, the weight of her words settling over him. I hope so. I really do. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the hum of the city outside the only sound in the room. Finally, Julia stood, placing a hand on Malcolm's shoulder. You've got more to do, she said with a grin. No resting yet. Malcolm laughed softly. Don't worry, I'm not done just yet. A few weeks later, Malcolm found himself standing on the steps of the Capitol, watching as a crowd gathered in the square below. It was a peaceful protest, organized by Lena and her fellow activists, demanding action on the housing reform bill they had been working on for months. The bill was one of the many pieces of legislation that Malcolm had shepherded through the halls of power, and now it was on the cusp of becoming law. As he watched the crowd, young and old, black and white, all united by a shared vision of justice, Malcolm felt a deep sense of pride. This was the legacy he had worked for, not just the laws or the policies, but the people. The next generation standing on his shoulders, ready to take the fight even further than he ever could. Lena stood at the front of the crowd, holding a megaphone and leading a chant that echoed off the Capitol's walls. Her voice was strong, her presence commanding, and Malcolm couldn't help but smile. She had come a long way since their first tense exchange, and while they didn't always agree, Malcolm had come to respect Lena's fire, her unwavering commitment to the cause. As he stood there, lost in thought, Lena spotted him on the steps and waved him over. Malcolm hesitated for a moment, then made his way down to the crowd, feeling the eyes of the people on him as he approached. Lena handed him the megaphone, her expression expectant but warm. "Want to say a few words, Senator?" she asked with a grin. Malcolm chuckled, taking the megaphone from her. "Just a few," he said, raising it to his lips. The crowd fell silent, their attention now fully focused on him. Malcolm looked out at them. So many faces, so many voices, all part of something much larger than himself. This was what it was all about. Not fame, not power, but people. "I've been in this fight for a long time," Malcolm began, his voice steady and clear. "And one thing I've learned is that progress doesn't happen all at once. It happens piece by piece, step by step, with every voice that speaks out, with every action we take." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "We're here today because we believe in something bigger than ourselves. We believe in justice, We believe in equality, and we believe that this fight is worth it." The crowd erupted into cheers, the energy palpable in the air. Malcolm smiled, feeling the weight of years of service, of struggle, lifted just a little. "We've still got work to do," Malcolm continued, his voice rising above the cheers. "But I look out at all of you, and I know this fight is in good hands. You are the future. You are the change." The crowd's cheers grew louder, and Malcolm handed the megaphone back to Lena, who gave him a knowing smile. "Thanks, Senator," she said, her voice filled with genuine appreciation. Malcolm nodded, stepping back to let Lena continue leading the protest. He watched her for a moment, the passion in her voice, the fire in her eyes, and he knew that the movement was in good hands. As the sun began to set over the Capitol, Malcolm stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He had fought many battles, faced many challenges, and while there was still much to be done, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had paved the way, but it was people like Lena who would continue the work. They would carry the torch, pushing the fight for justice further than he ever could. And that, Malcolm realized, was his legacy. With a final glance at the crowd, Malcolm turned and walked away from the steps, the sound of their chants echoing behind him. The fight would go on. But tonight, Malcolm Wright allowed himself to rest, knowing that the future was bright, and that the work he had dedicated his life to would continue long after he was gone. If you enjoyed this story and want to follow more of Malcolm Wright's journey, make sure to hit the subscribe button below. Stay tuned for more inspiring stories about justice, equality, and the fight for change.